In today's video, we'll be explaining what actually happened to everyone from Vault 11. But before we talk about the survivors who managed to escape this nightmare, we need to talk about the Vault's lore and how it tore this community apart, because it's more important than you think. Silence under Mojave. Vault 11 is one of only 5 shelters built in the Mojave region. This desert is already a corrupted place, hard hit by the bombs and the subsequent radioactive winds. It is populated by armed groups, camps of settlers willing to do anything to survive, and mutated beasts of every kind, from common rats, now as large as dogs, to disturbing centaurs, from lake lurks in the few aquatic environments to the terrifying deathclaws. But beneath the layers of dust and sand, chaos and anarchy have failed to penetrate the thick steel plates. And there exists a place where order and the system with a capital S are the categorical imperative that has governed the lives of hundreds of people for years. Impossible to break, impossible to bend, except at a great cost. The first time the player enters Vault 11, it appears quite unusual compared to most of its peers. The rooms are empty and silent. The lights work perfectly, terminals are scattered everywhere, and the entire environment is strangely orderly. A strange tranquility permeates the entire structure, so dense and absolute that it becomes, paradoxically, unsettling. This vault doesn't feel like a classic dungeon filled with enemies to defeat and loot to recover. The atmosphere inside is more like that of a tomb. Strange posters hang everywhere on the walls. They are election posters, political slogans, public notices about voting, civic duties, and collective responsibility. A rather unusual sight considering the usual nature of vaults. But behind this bizarre appearance lurks, once again, the sinister hand of Vault Tech. I want you for Vault Tech. As we know, before the war, Vault Tech presented itself as humanity's great savior, the only thing capable of guaranteeing a different safe conduct into the post-nuclear apocalypse world. But to do so, it requires many things: technology, raw materials, but above all, information. What are the best forms of society? How do humans respond when subjected to intense stress? How far are humans willing to go when survival is at stake? And it is precisely one of these aspects that Vault 11 aimed to investigate. Forced democracy, as they called it. A type of society that didn't simply involve a government imposed by another, a tyrant. On the contrary, what the inhabitants were forced to answer was the call to the voting booth, being forced to vote with their lives at stake. As the door closed, just before the bombs fell, a recorded voice listed to the new inhabitants the few simple rules they would have to follow from that day on. The instructions were as clear as they were terrifying. Every year, they were to gather and choose a member of the shelter, a new overseer, who would be offered to the Vault's machine and sacrificed. The penalty for failure to fulfill this duty would be the extermination of every single shelter inhabitant. The first generation of voters was shocked by the revelation of this discovery. They were trapped. The entrance had been sealed, and there was no escape from this cruel game. Panic and disbelief spread through the shelter like a wave. Some spoke of a malfunction. Others didn't believe the message was true, believing it impossible that Vault Tech would force them into such a perverse experiment. But the truth was, there was no escape. The Vault had made its point, and in the end, no one was willing to risk rebellion when their lives hung in the balance. They had to choose someone, or it would be the end for everyone. However, the decision in the end wasn't too difficult. One person was clearly more disliked than all the others: the current overseer. Indeed, he was the only one who had entered the vault already aware of the terrible mechanism to which everyone would be subjected. His silence about that despicable truth was precisely what tipped the balance of his companion's judgment toward him. Thus, after a year, the man was forced into the overseer's chamber, where he was executed. At that point, the vault dwellers would be safe, but only for another year. Then they would have to make a new decision. But they couldn't choose randomly. They needed criteria, a precise method that would allow for a decision, both impartial and definitive. So it was decided to apply a system already well known to all: elections. Shortly before the end of the year, all the inhabitants would be called to the polls and would have a single vote to choose the next sacrifice, who would hold the office of overseer for a year and then embrace his own inevitable sacrifice. A simple, practical, just solution in all its terribleness: the elections. For a while, things went relatively well. Admittedly, there was a constant air of tension in the vault. People walked on their toes, terrified of making a mistake, and ending up concentrating their neighbors' votes on themselves. After all, the collective opinion was clear. If someone had to be sacrificed, then it was only right that it be someone who deserved it. Following this trend, the elections soon became increasingly complex and intense. Actual campaigns, accompanied by rallies, began, but they were not aimed at gathering votes, but rather at steering them towards someone else. The elections had become trials, complete with lists of charges. Anything could be a pretext for ruin. Small mix-ups, antipathies, jealousies. Guilt was becoming a currency, and salvation was the commodity that could be purchased. Yet, despite everything, for a full 16 years, the elections ran smoothly, without a hitch. But it's clear that, with such a method, as has always happened throughout history, someone would soon find a way to manipulate the system in their favor. Thus, slowly, actual parties began to form. These electoral blocs continually sought to gather new members in order to increase their political clout and steer the elections toward their preferred candidate, thus ensuring the safety of their members. Soon, 6 parties emerged, constantly at odds with each other: the Allied Service Workers Bloc, the Divine Will Bloc, the Human Dignity Bloc, the Justice Bloc, the United Vault Technicians Bloc, and the Utilitarian Bloc. Every year, these parties battled each other, attempting to elect the best members of the opposing camps. And to achieve this goal, no means were forbidden. Thus, corruption, favor trading, and bad gossip began to multiply, especially in the run-up to elections. Suspicion became a weapon, and one wrong word was enough for someone to use it against the opposing candidate. All this also led to an inevitable, yet logical, consequence. If every year a dangerous member of an opposing party was sacrificed, judged to be such for his intelligence, moral character, and leadership ability, this also meant that every year the vault lost one of its most worthy inhabitants. The result was that in just a few years, the community was depleted of notable individuals, and the most despicable were left in charge, often unfit for their duties, but simply skilled in the art of politics in its worst sense. A domino effect. Things escalated with a relatively small, yet serious, incident. One of the many acts of tyranny imposed by party leaders. One of the most influential members of the Justice Bloc, Roy Gottlieb, forced a woman, Katherine Stone, into a vile act of blackmail. He informed the woman that her husband, Nathan, had been mentioned at a party meeting as a possible candidate for the upcoming elections. Katherine couldn't have known this, but the truth was that Nathan used to play poker with some Justice Bloc members, and his recent winnings had made him hated by many of them. Gottlieb's offer was clear: sexual favors in exchange for a promise to use his influence within the party to prevent Nathan from running. The woman was clearly reluctant, but she knew that if her husband were nominated, he would have little chance of surviving. Eventually, she gave in, but this only made her situation even worse. Word spread quickly among the party members, and Katherine was forced to sleep with other men in the group. However, this wasn't enough. Despite the agreements made, the Justice Bloc decided to betray her anyway and nominated Nathan as the next overseer. Katherine was filled with anger and dismay at the news, but it didn't take long to hatch a plan for revenge. Her reasoning was simple. The party was strong in the number of votes it could bring to the elections, so cutting some of those votes would also take away its power. So, little by little, Katherine began eliminating the men who had threatened her. She managed to significantly thin out the group's ranks before being discovered, but her plan was far from unsuccessful. In fact, she confessed to the current overseer, who questioned her about the events, that she had always intended to turn herself in. That way, she would surely be chosen as the next overseer, and her husband would be spared. And so it went. Once word of the murders spread, the vault residents overwhelmingly voted Katherine to be executed within a year. They could certainly have sentenced her to death immediately as punishment for her crimes, but why waste an annual sacrifice? What they didn't know was that Katherine had one last card to play. As soon as she came to power, she decided to repeal Overseer Order 745, the provision that established elections as the method of selecting the annual sacrifice. Instead, the vault's automated system would randomly choose the victim each year. This move stripped the parties of all power, and their members suddenly found themselves facing the same risk of death as all other citizens. Naturally, this didn't sit well with many, and Gottlieb himself, terrified of being chosen as overseer, incited the remaining members of his party. The men armed themselves and, in an attempt to seize control of the vault, launched a full-blown coup d'etat. Their goal wasn't to overthrow Katherine with a direct attack, but rather to occupy all the key points of the vault, such as the pantry, the water center, and the power generator. Once those positions were secured, she would be forced to surrender quickly. The battle was extremely fierce, but the Justice Block encountered much greater resistance than they had anticipated. The action escalated into a full-blown battle that dragged on for days, resulting in a terrifying death toll. In the end, exhausted, only 5 survivors remained in the entire shelter. A bitter discovery. We don't know exactly who the last 5 inhabitants were, but we do know what happened in their final days thanks to a message found at the vault entrance and some other information retrieved from the terminals. Despite the decision not to continue the war, there remained the need to choose a new overseer to sacrifice to the vault. But did it really make sense? All their companions were dead. There was no hope of help from the outside world, and at that rate, they only had 5 years left before they were extinguished, sacrificed one by one. So they made an extreme but final decision. End it all now. Finally rebel against that cruel system that had led them to self-destruction and choose not to elect another overseer. If they had to die, at least they would do so by picking up the last pieces of their pride as human beings, and above all, they would do it together. So they proceeded and announced their decision to the system, ready to embrace the computer's punishment. But it never came. To the survivors' dismay, instead of facing death, they saw an automated message, a holotape, play.
Congratulations, citizens of Vault 11. You have made the decision not to sacrifice one of your own. You can walk with your head held high, knowing that your commitment to human life is a shining example to us all. And to make that feeling of pride even sweeter, I have some exciting news. Despite what you were led to believe, the population of Vault 11 is not going to be exterminated for its disobedience. Instead, the mechanism to open the main vault door has now been enabled, and you can come and go at your leisure. But not so fast. Be sure to check with your overseer to find out if it's safe to leave.
The cheerful voice congratulated them on having made the right choice. They had rebelled against a tyrannical imposition that forced them to make an immoral decision and had taken the only human option possible, refusing to sacrifice their fellow humans in exchange for survival. As a final act, the computer unlocked the vault doors, finally setting them free. As a final recommendation, the voice advised the survivors to ensure the outside world was habitable and free of radiation before attempting to leave, because, after all, here at Vault-Tec, your safety is our #1 priority. The discovery completely shattered the spirits of the 5. It had all been pointless. Or worse, it had all been a cruel and pointless experiment. Vault-Tec had treated them like laboratory animals, mocked them like a cat would a mouse, and they had completely fallen for it. They had followed the rules. They had exterminated each other, and only in the end, like a twist of fate, had they even managed to discover the truth, just as if an evil demon had guided their actions for a final laugh. Completely annihilated, the group dragged themselves to the entrance of the vault, still debating what to do. 4 of them simply wanted to end it all. They were ashamed of their actions. They didn't want that cursed story to spread outside the shelter, and above all, they couldn't bear the weight of the guilt of having killed their companions. But the 5th didn't agree. He wanted to live, precisely for the sake of all the people who hadn't made it. Dying would have meant giving Vault-Tec its final victory, but he wanted to pass on those events, so that others wouldn't repeat their mistakes. We learn what happened thanks to the last pieces of the message found at the entrance. We hear the sound of 4 gunshots in the audio, likely suicides, but the 5th never comes. What we hear is the sound of the gun falling to the floor, just before the audio cuts out. We find 4 skeletons nearby, lying on the dusty floor for 200 years. We have no further information about the 5th man, an inconvenient legacy. The story of Vault 11 can probably be considered one of the most tragic in all of Fallout lore, but it is also one of the most revealing. Many other vaults have been destroyed by scientific experiments gone wild. Viruses, spores, uncontrolled madness, radiation. But Vault 11 was torn apart by something much deeper and more subtle: blind obedience and fear of others. If we think about it, the crux of the experiment was neither the sacrifice nor the overseer's choice. Those were simply the mechanisms through which the experiment was perpetuated. The true test was how long a community would continue to follow an unjust rule, knowing it was morally wrong, simply because it was presented as inevitable. If we think about it, it was all an illusion from the start. True, Vault-Tec had threatened the extermination of every Vault resident if the rules were not followed, but it was just that, a threat. In fact, the inhabitants never had proof that this threat was real. They never saw weapons or other equipment capable of carrying out this measure. There weren't even armed guards ready to act should the order be given. What they had was simply a recorded voice, a set of rules, and their fear. They had put their morality on one side of the scale and their own survival on the other. The result was the decision to obey in order to save their lives, even if it would cost others. And this is where the experiment becomes truly disturbing. The inhabitants of the shelter were not special people, but absolutely ordinary people. Men and women with lives, families, friends, and the hope of seeing a new world beyond the nightmare of the apocalypse. But when they made that first choice, when they accepted with all their hearts the first sacrifice, they crossed a moral threshold from which there was no turning back, a threshold that would lead them into an ever steeper and darker abyss. What Vault 11 demonstrates is that evil doesn't need monsters or evil men to spread. All it takes is ordinary people who choose to bow their heads and not rebel against what is wrong. The electoral system itself became a cruel mirror of their society, and it perfectly reflected every single corrupt detail. The overseer wasn't chosen for his administrative skills, but solely so he could be sacrificed. This led to a distortion of daily life. Better to remain silent and not attract attention. Better to mind one's own business and not meddle in other people's affairs. Better never to argue with anyone. And when someone came along who was capable of gathering a modicum of power in their hands, then the moral imperative of the time became better to accept the abuses of the powerful, so as to avoid their retaliation. In fact, this experiment isn't simply a critique of the democratic system per se, but what it seeks to demonstrate is what happens to democracy when it is stripped of all ethics. It turns into a simple formal ritual, ready to justify any atrocity as long as it is approved by a majority vote and the silence of the opposition. In this context, voting is no longer a useful weapon to determine one's fate, but rather becomes a way to cover one's cowardice. If things go badly, it's not my fault. We all decided that. Perhaps the most tragic part of this whole story is that the solution, the positive ending, was always there within reach. It wasn't hidden, locked away in a safe, or encrypted within a computer. All it took was simply being human, having the strength and cohesion to refuse to be subjugated, and to stand together against an injustice that was simply too great. Sure, the risk was death, but was that really the greatest evil? Unfortunately, Vault-Tec was well aware of human psychology. Perhaps a single person could have made the right decision. Perhaps even a small group could have done so. But in the case of an entire community, a new mechanism came into play. The herd effect. Everything can be accepted because the blame is shared. No one can point the finger at anyone else because they are all guilty. And if everyone has blood on their hands, then it's as if everyone is innocent. In fact, at what point can we finally break the cycle and make a truly moral decision, not driven by fear, when there are only 5 survivors left? And in any case, the revelation is devastating because we discover that it was all in vain, that we have always made the wrong choice, and all our cowardly fears and weaknesses are finally exposed, brought to the surface, first and foremost to ourselves. Denial is no longer useful because the truth is blinding and painful. In reality, it wasn't the riot and the weapons that destroyed the vault, but the truth. A truth that could have been clear, but that we decided to ignore for the sake of a clear conscience. The last 4 suicides are driven to this extreme choice, not by simple pain, but by shame, and by the awareness of what they sacrificed because of their fear. Their guilt is having made a choice they knew was wrong, but which they made anyway, of their own free will. The imposition was merely an illusion, a game of mirrors and shadows. There had always been only them and their conscience. On this occasion, Vault-Tec carries out a true masterpiece of cruelty. For the first time, the enemy is not external. It is not an unknown evil, and it is not even simply society itself. The enemy comes from within. It has always been among us. It is ourselves. In our most perverse exception, we can be our own adversaries. The final message of this story is merciless but clear. The end of humanity does not come with nuclear bombs falling from the sky, but when humans stop behaving like humans and become willing to sell out their own morality. This is the banality of evil. It's easy to delegate our conscience to reassuring obedience. But when the consequences come knocking on our door, we discover they're as bitter as the worst poison. Exploring Vault 21 doesn't just make us feel horror, but unease. Probably because this time we're not talking about a story from a distant, dystopian, and unlikely future, but about something that has already happened in the past. and is still part of our history today. We can ask ourselves what we would have done in their place, as if it were a philosophical exercise. But in reality, there's a much more uncomfortable question we should ask ourselves. How many times have I already consented to something I know is wrong, just because I've been told there's no alternative?